Hello. We are talking today to Econoboy about the IMF. Welcome, Econoboy. And the way that I figured I'd do it is that I'm talking to Econoboy for roughly an hour or so about his latest ventures into the debate world on YouTube and some controversies about the IMF that came about in those debates. And then at the end of that, I'll just scroll through the chat. I'll stick around and I'll try to answer questions that popped up in the chat. So, Econoboy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and also why, what happened? What happened with this debate about the IMF?
Hey everyone, my name is Econoboy. I do videos similar to Joeri on the Money and Macro channel, pretty much just informative economic videos. I do a fair bit more discussions and debates on my channel, mostly because I'm just interested in doing them. So if you're interested in sort of scripted analysis and discussions and debates mostly centered around economic issues, then you can subscribe to the Econoboy YouTube channel. In terms of the debate I had recently, so the debate I had recently was with a guy named Vosh, who is one of the largest leftist socialist content creators on YouTube and Twitch. And he's a live streamer. He is, like I said, a socialist, and I wanted to debate him on one of his videos that he released about the Norwegian economy, where he claimed that the Norwegian economy and social democracies broadly are sort of tied intrinsically and reliant on unequal exchange, which is pretty much just the exploitation of the third world, the global south, the least developed countries, places like that. And I took the stance that indeed, the global north is not actually as dependent on sort of screwing over the global south in terms of trade relations as much as you might think. And part of this discussion was maybe about 1/3 of it was about the IMF. And sort of Vosh and socialists a lot of time sort of postulate the idea that the IMF and the CIA and the U.S. military and the World Bank, these institutions serve neo-colonialism, imperialism, economic imperialism, I should say, and ultimately serve transitively, in part or directly, depending on who you're talking to stifle socialist governance, social programs and things that would help ordinary people in favor of liberalization and capitalism to a certain extent. Vosh took the stance that this was more transitive, so they're ideologically motivated to liberalize markets as much as possible and end sort of state involvement in the economy as much as possible. And so that sort of, transitively, like I said, stifles socialist governments abroad. And that was part of his argument for how these, sort of global north nations prevent the sustainable development of global south nations. I feel like that's as reasonable a summary of his argument as I could. And I took the position that the IMF was really more of just a bank, not necessarily an institution tasked with ending good development of the global south nations, more just a lending institution tasked with getting its money back on its loan. And then Joeri reached out to me basically saying that you're both kind of right and kind of wrong. And so I'm here now to learn a little bit, and it should be fun.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so this was exactly, so I was watching this discussion between the two of you, and sort of it's just something, because I teach about the history of the IMF a little bit at my university, and it's just something that I really often come across, and I think it's such a shame that there are these two worlds existing. One really focused on sort of the technical details, that's economics, what the IMF does, why it was invented, and then there's this other world that's more sort of political, about looking at some of the, to be frank, horrible mistakes that the IMF made, especially in countries in the global south, but also if you look at a country like Greece, for example. And I just figured that this was a very sort of strange, that these two seem to live side by side a little bit and not talk to each other that much. So, you bumping into him there seemed to be a little bit of a start of that conversation. But because you both were talking about something else, I figured there was room to flesh it out a little bit here. So yeah, that being said, so you explained that you thought of the IMF as being a bank, right? So is this informed by your study of economics? Is that where this comes from?
No, I don't think I had. I believe I had any courses really talking about the IMF. I had a very sort of data-oriented economics education. Not much in way of sort of economic history or institutions. So the information, sort of what I know about the IMF, has been self-taught.
Right. Yeah. So I think this is another point that is a bit of a tragedy, I think, for economics. And this is also something that we get a lot of flack for in the economics Twitter space. And that is that the history of economic thought and also the history of economics is just not taught in most mainstream programs anymore. Or in some cases, it's just, like one small course, or it's part of a week like, but also, the IMF has this history about Bretton Woods and all of that. So I figured we could sort of structure this talk a little bit by first going into sort of the economic angle, like what the IMF was created for, what the idea was, and then visiting sort of the dark side of the IMF a little bit, and then getting back to all of it at the end. Does that sound good?
Sounds great. Let's do it.
Yeah, so this is also great for me because I'm going to teach this course actually next semester called Global Finance and Growth at the University of Groningen. So this is a little bit of a practice run for me.
I'll be your first student.
Exactly, along with the chat, which I am keeping an eye on. Where there are already some passionate talk. There's already some passionate talk about a criminal paramilitary organization.
I saw that,
but that's not how it started out. So I think the irony a little bit of especially sort of people on the left not liking the IMF is that when it was created, one of the main instigators of the IMF was John Maynard Keynes, which is a famous, not super lefty economist, but still typically seen as being on the left. And it was really...
Certainly.
Yeah, right? Keynes. Have we heard about him? Very influential at the time, especially like after, because you had the Great Depression, where people just didn't do Keynesianism. And that was under the gold standard. And there was just really this sort of economic consensus that finance should not be trusted, that governments should intervene in times of a crisis, inspired by Keynes, but also that the gold standard had really sort of exacerbated a lot of global inequalities, but also these types of recessions, because, what happened, like gold is a fixed quantity. So if sort of there's a loss of trust in some country, let's say a country from the global south, like in South America or something, what will happen is that there will be a run on their gold reserves. And since these will run out, they're just basically screwed. And their currency will collapse and their imports will become impossible to pay off. And since a lot of these are essential, this country is in big trouble. So I think that's an interesting backdrop for all of this. And it's also quite similar to how we view it today, right?
Yeah, I would say so. It's interesting, the idea of a gold standard exacerbating inequalities. I guess that's because less developed countries might have a harder time either mining or acquiring gold for the purposes of reserves rather than wealthier nations, which is interesting. I've never quite thought about a gold standard in that way. So I guess to a certain extent, the IMF could have been created to alleviate those sorts of things. But yeah, that's all interesting, and that seems very, very accurate. Of course, John Maynard Keynes, as far as I'm aware, was not a socialist or anything like that. But he was certainly a left of center thinker, and probably the most influential. He's probably the economist whose thought is most present in actual economic policy today that I can think of.
Macroeconomic then, right?
Well, yes, of course.
Yeah. Just a bit of nuance. Yeah, exactly. But the thing is that, so at the time, you have to imagine that at the time, the United States was by far the biggest economy. It was the victor, but it was also the biggest economy accounting, I think, if I just remember the research I did for this little stream, roughly 60% of GDP. And then also, hard to believe now, the United States was sort of the export champion of the world. Like the industry was in the United States. It was like the Germany, China, and Japan of what they are today. It was back then. And at the same time, the British Empire was declining. But still, it had the prominence enough to sort of, and also it had John Maynard Keynes, where sort of Keynes and an American named Harry Dexter White were sort of seen as the architects of this new monetary order called the Bretton Woods system, which was actually a gold standard. But what they did at the time was like, okay, this gold standard thing, it does really help a lot of countries because it facilitates trade. It's just another way, basically, from an international perspective, of fixing exchange rates, right? Which makes trade much, much easier. But they looked at the past and they were like, okay, but these past gold standards, they always collapsed. And they were extremely harsh on countries that faced sort of like a bank run, basically. So they faced somewhat of a liquidity problem, you could say, and then were unduly punished for it. So what the IMF was invented then for was to lend to countries that ran balance of payments deficits. That's econ technical speak for countries that imported way too much. And at the time, that was really needed because Europe and Japan, for example, were in ruins, right? So it made sense that they needed to import a lot from the United States, like machines and, all of that to rebuild their economies. And I think that's where your view of it being a bank comes from. Is that right?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent it is. I mean, I knew that obviously the IMF is really a lending institution, and I call it a bank sort of simplistically. It's more complicated than that because of how the IMF actually lends money, and the types of financing to countries is different than you would obviously apply for as maybe a mortgage or a personal loan or a credit card or something like that. But to me, that's where the frame of the IMF as a bank, a lending institution, kind of comes from.
Yeah, and it's ironic because the thing is that Keynes sort of wanted it to be a bank. He called this the ICU, in other words, the International Clearing Union. But also Harry Dexter White, which someone in the chat pointed out, was actually a communist spy. I've heard about this. I'm not sure exactly on the history of that, but even if he was a communist spy, then you could say that the socialists definitely had some input in the IMF. But I'm not going to confirm it because I'm not sure if that's true, even though I heard of it. And they created sort of the IMF as a fund instead, whereas Keynes wanted it to be a bank. And that's very important also for people sort of watching my channel, that banks create money. So what Keynes had in mind is that the IMF could sort of create money and sort of expand and contract liquidity based on the needs of the global economy. But that didn't happen. And so instead it became a fund. And that's why it's called the International Monetary Fund. And that means just that sort of the member countries put in a certain amount of gold and dollars, because the dollar was already sort of the main currency of Bretton Woods, just under gold, the only currency convertible into gold. And that's why it became a fund. And the implication of that was that it just didn't have a lot of financial firepower to lend. So it was not a very strong institution. But it did help. It did help countries like, for example, I think France was the first one to borrow from the IMF. And the weird thing is that these were just completely different times. Like international finance was not very powerful at all. And countries borrowed from the IMF to finance imports. Whereas nowadays, countries borrow, that run a current account deficit, so they import too much. They borrow from the global banks. So actually, that's kind of it's, dare I say, almost a socialist vision of the international order, right? Like run by government institutions rather than private ones.
Right. Okay. So to a certain extent, so you're saying that right now, well, it sounds like you said the same thing. So back in the day, people financed their imports through the IMF, and today they finance their current account deficit, which sounds sort of like the same thing, but maybe explain a little bit more.
Oh, yeah. No, so it's the same thing. Indeed, like back in the days, if you wanted to import something, like let's say you're a country in the Netherlands, right? And you wanted to import something from the USA, you needed dollars, right? To pay that US company. So what you would then do is you would go to your central bank and ask for those dollars. And that's very different than from how it is today, right? Because if I want to buy something from you, Econoboy, at some point you might come up with some merchandise to support your channel. I just go to a bank to a private bank to convert my euros to dollars, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so it was much more of a government system back in the day, but the problem was that it was just only suitable to sort of balance out these trade differences, but not yet. Like if a country got into trouble, it didn't have the firepower to basically save it.
Okay, I mean that makes sense with the limitations.
Yeah. And then I think, because some people in the chat are also mentioning this, we have to get to SDRs. Have you heard about SDRs before?
I have, yeah. I mean, I made a video about the IMF, and I looked into it for that video. And SDRs are it's kind of an interesting name, because really what it seems that SDRs are is it's almost the currency of the IMF, which is just a basket of other currencies sort of standardized into single units. It's an interesting concept.
Yeah, exactly. So it stands for special drawing rights. And as far as I know, it was sort of invented later at something called the Rio Agreements, so in Rio de Janeiro, I guess, in 1967. And this is sort of in a bit of an ironic twist when Keynes got his way, when the IMF did become like a bank, because it then could create currency, namely SDRs. However, weirdly enough, if you go to the IMF website or something and look at their balance sheet, they aren't there. There are some SDRs that it holds, but not on its liability side, which is what you would expect from a bank. Like, for example, your Federal Reserve creates dollars, right? They are on the liability side of the Federal Reserve. But the SDRs are not on the liability side of the IMF, which I was actually a bit surprised by. But the sneaky trick that they're pulling is they're saying, these are not claims on the IMF. These are claims on the currencies of the members of the IMF. And supposedly they can sort of trade these for actual real world currencies like the dollar, yen, Chinese renminbi, but it's voluntary.
Right.
Yeah.
That's an interesting workaround.
Yeah,
Sure.
It's a bit sneaky. They are. I mean, to be honest, I think that should just be on the balance sheet of the IMF, because they say, well, it's not a claim of the IMF, but dollars from the Federal Reserve. You can't do anything with them at the Federal Reserve either, right? You can't exchange them for gold or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of odd, for sure.
So I think that's just a bit of the technical details. But then, so that's when sort of the IMF did become a bank in a way, and it could create money, and that's what the SDRs came in. And that gave the IMF a lot more flexibility to step in as a lender of last resort. But the thing is, when the IMF was started, it could make loans to countries, but it was actually very uncommon for them to say to a country, you have to do this, you have to do this austerity, for example. You have to cut government spending, and then you can get our money. No. This wasn't the case at the start. They started out, just giving these loans, and then if a country couldn't pay it back, then they would say, well, then you have to maybe cut government spending. But the thing is that after the collapse of the Bretton Woods gold standard system, the IMF had a bit of a different role and stepped more into this sort of lender of last resort role to save countries, which sounds very noble as well, right? But the thing is, then you had something called the Washington Consensus. And this is, I think, where we get to the subject of controversy. Had you heard of the Washington Consensus?
I have. It gets brought up quite a lot in conversations about sort of international economics and socialism.
Yeah, exactly. So what's your take on it?
I think there's problems with it. Obviously, to a certain extent, the idea of sort of a strict fiscal discipline, getting, limiting your deficits to a certain extent might not be correct, right? Because it seems like a lot of the times deficits can be good if they're productively spent. In general, that sort of austerity politics, I think, is probably not in the current sort of economic hegemony that we have viewed very favorably, which I think is fair. But other than that, I think a lot of the other stuff, trying to have robust systems for foreign direct investment and respecting foreign investor rights, and to a certain extent liberalizing institutions and trade probably makes some sense, right? That if we assume that foreign investment and sort of also the cultivation of domestic investment are good ways to build wealth, well, building strong institutions around those things probably makes some sense. And to a certain extent, you can build wealth through the liberalization of an economy, assuming if it's a transition, you're doing it in a very purposeful manner that isn't sort of all at once, that could lead to a lot of transition costs, like we saw with the USSR. So stuff like that, I think, is reasonable, but there's definitely some give and take with the Washington Consensus, I would say.
Yeah. So I mean, I think this is where we might get to our first point of disagreement, Econoboy.
All right.
Yeah.
My God.
Damn. We finally made it. But no, I mean, the thing with these sort of discussions is always that it's not about the extremes, right? It's about sort of, do you need a little bit of foreign investment or do you need a lot of foreign investment? And it's I think that you're sort of saying, you need a little bit of foreign investment, but I think you're actually sort of pretty far to that you need a lot of foreign investment. That's what it sounds like. But I would say, obviously, you need a little bit. But I would say most of the Western economies developed without it. For example, Europe, after the Second World War, in the Bretton Woods system, there was massive capital controls. Capital controls was the norm. There was free trade, but very limited capital. And so, of course, you had some foreign capital coming in the form of the Marshall Plan. So that's in government sort of aid. And also at the time, you had sort of lots of, people forget this, I think, that you had lots of state institutions. Like, for example, in Germany, you have the KDW, the German State Development Bank. Also here in the Netherlands, you have an institution called, it's now a private bank, but it used to be a state bank, NIBC, I think. And similarly, you had all of these sort of big state institutions when we were developed. And similarly in the United States, I think you had a lot of state institutions, right, in the 50s and 60s and 70s before they were liberalized. So the weird thing is, I think this is where a bit of the controversy comes from. Like, why did the West successfully develop with some strong state institutions and with very limited capital? And why do we now need these Western investors?
Right. I would agree to that to a certain extent. That, like, if you look at developing countries that are doing quite well, foreign investment as a percentage of total investment is often, it's not like 80% of their investment is foreign investment. So I would agree with that to a certain extent. To me, it's really more so just the idea of one of the worst things that a country can do, it seems, for their economy is to have very sort of vague and not particularly stable rights for investors, whether they be domestic or foreign. I mean, at least the way that I would think about it, I don't know. These things are regulated differently, naturally, but typically I would say that fundamentally you'd want these two to have some similar right when they make an investment in the country, domestic and foreign investors, because it seems that whenever a country sort of engages in expropriating capital or, doesn't have a strong security apparatus to protect capital, it seems like when these things are the case in a country, when there's domestic instability, and especially when that instability leads to, basically countries not being able to, or investors not being able to retain their investments, that this leads to really, really negative effects for the economy. And so that's really my point when I say, protecting the rights of investors. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, but I wonder if it's true, because sort of then the elephant in the room becomes China, right? Like, how safe have your investments in China been? How safe have your investor rights been in China? And how successful has China been?
Yeah, that is arguably a good point, but I think that in general, I'm not sure. I guess the answer is just I'm not sure in this regard. I don't know how often China expropriates capital or sort of, basically totally fucks over investors in their country. It seems like on one hand, there's like the view of China where, in fact, China is a neoliberal, like super, super duper capitalist oriented country where, a lot of their wealth was built on the back of this sort of liberalization, which is certainly not the entire story because they still, of course, have huge sort of state control of the economy. But then on the other hand, you've got this view of China where no, it's still a socialist sort of communist society, and there's a lot of controls and everything like that, and it's not a safe investment. And so I would need to look into that a bit more. And that's not to mention that obviously you've got other countries that seem to liberalize quite heavily and do quite badly, but then others that did the same and seem to do well enough. So
what are the success stories then from this massive liberalization? Countries that liberalized before they developed, right? Not after.
Yeah. So some people look at the Asian tigers, for instance. So the Asian tigers, to be fair, had heavy state involvement in the economy, but when it comes to trade, it seemed like they were very outward facing. They were sort of eager to get that investment. And it seems like today a lot of those
but that's different, right?
economies.
Those are two different things, Econoboy, no? Being trade outward facing, that's a different thing than being eager to get that foreign investment is I think what you're implying.
Sure. So when I say someone is sort of outward facing and looking for that foreign investment, to a certain extent that's related to their trade liberalization. That's what I would say, right? But you're saying that indeed you can be outward facing in trade, but not necessarily care about foreign investment. Maybe explain the difference to me.
Yeah. So the thing is, okay, I think that we need to make a distinction between, like, do you need foreign investment for development? Then I think you need to make a distinction between, do you need foreign currencies? Because I think, like, in theory, every country can develop with their own investment through the banking system, creating credit and activating sort of capacity that's not being used. But of course, that's not the whole story, because you do typically need quite a bit of foreign currency to get started. To, like, if you want to build a chip industry, you're going to need to buy some machines, and they're not typically made in a developing country, right? And then there are a couple of ways to make that foreign currency, and I think the IMF has really been pushing since the 80s sort of the view that you need investment from abroad first, and then you can develop that, those industries. You can use that foreign currency to develop those industries. But the experience of the Asian tigers and also of Europe and also of Japan, for example, has very much been that they had this export-oriented growth model where they got foreign currency by exporting first simple products. They started sort of low in the value chain and then moved up. And that's very different because it becomes a question of control then, right? Like, who controls your factories? Is it foreign investors, or is it, you earn it through exports mostly? Of course, this is never in extremes. And then you build those factories yourself, or more, what I think was the most common approach very often also in China, like a cap on foreign ownership of 49%, for example, right?
Well, yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like from what you're saying, the Asian tigers development certainly was trade oriented to a certain extent, but it's more a question of how, what's the proportion of domestic investment to foreign investment, and indeed, if arguably, if a country has too much foreign investment, then a lot of that wealth might not be able to build and accumulate in the form of more robust capital and therefore more sort of profitable industries for the domestic country.
Yeah, exactly. And another argument that scholars have been sort of coming forward with now is that what they say is, like, foreign capital is very fickle, is what they call it, meaning that it's very likely to come in huge quantities, especially if there's like a quick buck to be made in the form of an asset boom, for example. And then it withdraws extremely quickly as well. So, you can see this, I think, compare it with sort of bank funding or something, where if a bank borrows very heavily from financial markets, it might become a bit more fragile than if it has a very solid depositor base. And I think for a country, you can look at it like that a little bit as well, that if they sort of try to get foreign currency through a solid export machine, that this is much more liable than through foreign investment, which might sort of follow sort of asset booms and busts, and then just leave, and then you're in a currency crisis. And then, just to get back to the IMF, you have to call in the IMF. And this is exactly what happened during the Asian financial crisis of 1997 for countries like Thailand and South Korea specifically. And there, I think they were both rescued by the IMF along with a couple of other countries, like the Philippines, for example. And there, I think you really see sort of where the IMF dogma went wrong, in the sense that in all of these countries, the IMF came in with its Washington Consensus ideas. You need fiscal discipline. You need to quit sort of fuel subsidies and all of that, which I do think makes sense. But also, you have to have flexible exchange rates. You cannot undervalue it anymore. You have to have trade liberalization further, liberalization of investment, massive protection for foreign investors, all these state industries privatized, deregulation. And there, I think the view comes in like, maybe the IMF has been captured a little bit by the elite business or investor interest of Western investors. But also, sort of more from an economic perspective, Like that's a blanket advice that some of it makes no macroeconomic sense. And some of it only makes sense for certain countries. Like, for example, at the time, South Korea was very developed already. So, okay, maybe some of those state enterprises had become a bit bloated. Some liberalization had to be made sense there. But for example, for a country like Thailand, that didn't make sense. And then they both got the same advice. And I think that's just, trying to get back a little bit to our IMF discussion. That's where I think a lot of the criticism also came from. So one, some of the policy advice is just horrible. And two, blanket advice doesn't work for every country. And typically it works better for countries that are already developed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is where I think that Bosch and I, again, seemed to fundamentally agree with some of the problems of the IMF as an institution, where it does seem like the IMF has, at least historically, had some sort of a basket of policies that they would recommend to countries with some sort of deviation depending on the country. But it seems like broadly the IMF had a view that liberalization equals wealth, equals an ability to sustainably finance yourself, equals an ability to pay off your sort of IMF loan if you need one. And it seems like what you're saying, what I would agree with, and what perhaps the most modern economic thinkers might say is that this is not a one size fits all thing, and even liberalization in and of itself might not necessarily build the kind of sustainable wealth model that you'd want if you're a developing country. And it's interesting. I've never thought about the idea of arguably to a certain extent, foreign investor rights don't necessarily just mean you won't expropriate their capital, which is kind of how I viewed it, but it might also mean how much access you give foreign investors. Maybe you only give them 20% access to your markets, and maybe that 20% is super duper solid. Like you're not going to just steal their 20%, but it might only be 20%. So that's maybe where the sort of capital controls come in to help domestically build wealth, which doesn't really jive with the IMF and sort of their view of development, at least their view of development for quite some time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think then also sort of one pain point that came in from all of this is that, for example, if we skip ahead in time a little bit and go to Greece, that not only did these policies sort of work very counterproductively, it was also that it was felt as being sort of implemented in a very humiliating way. So, for example, if you had Yanis Varoufakis, who used to be the Greek prime minister, he wrote this amazing book about sort of the political details and how the austerity measures were implemented there. And they had this thing called the Troika, which meant the ECB, European Commission, and IMF coming in to sort of tell the Greek people and government, like, hey, this is what you have to do. And he tells in very great detail sort of the arrogant and humiliating way that they go about it, which at one point, it doesn't completely make no sense in the sense that the Greek government had screwed up to that point. But it is something, I think, which also adds to their impopularity. And also, he for example, describes in great detail, like, the IMF people just came in airplanes, and then they got into their blinded cars and they drove to the ministry. They didn't even look around. They didn't see the protesters. They didn't sort of look at the situation. They just came in with their blanket orthodoxy. And I think that is it's not the main point I wanted to make, but it's definitely a part of the story that tells you why the IMF are so hated.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I made in my IMF video, I made a meme, and it was the kid crying on the bench that was saying, it's just that I really wanted to hate the IMF, and then I come in and say, you still can, right? You can certainly still criticize the IMF for a lot of things, for a lot of reasons. But I think that the more conspiratorial view of the IMF is kind of where I have an issue with, because if only for the reason, I say in the video, that it makes it harder to solve those issues, right? If you feel like there's problems in the government for how the government serves ordinary people, it's one thing to say, oh, I feel like donors have an outsized influence, and I feel like if we engaged in more sort of higher taxes on rich people and stuff like that, we could make some positive change, but we have to address the donors, right? It's one thing to believe that, and it's another thing to believe that there's a cabal of child bloodletting pedophiles that run the government and are simply puppeting everything. It's like, okay, well, you're on such a level of conspiracy that it's almost so conspiratorial it would be impossible to solve these issues, right? And similarly with the IMF, I think there's a lot of real criticism and real reform that the IMF should, either has done or should do in the future. And it seems that the more conspiratorial view, it's almost as if there's no way to solve these issues other than getting rid of the IMF and instituting sort of a global sort of socialist movement or revolution, or trying to institute frameworks where the global South can be autonomous with the global North, stuff like that. And I think that's where I have a problem with that thinking, because it seems that it wouldn't be the most effective at actually solving the issues that we might agree on.
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, I think that goes way overboard, and it also goes into an issue that I discussed on my Q&A last time, where people sort of asked me what I thought about neoliberal reforms in Japan around the 80s, and that famous economist Richard Werner believed to be sort of a big neoliberal conspiracy, whereas I see there much more sort of the thinking of the time. Like this was just how economists thought at that time. I think there is a lot of writing about how this stuff was pushed by specific interests, but that doesn't take away from the fact that I think the Washington consensus was a consensus also among many people that were not directly funded by special interests, because it was just aligned with economic thinking at the time, and also some of the horrible models that us economists produced back then. But actually, the thing I wanted to get into next is something that is hotly debated in the chat section, and I think we didn't discuss enough, and that is sticking with Greece.
Let's you ready to lose some fans? Let's lose some fans.
No, I'm actually going to agree with them, Icona Boy. So I'll let you take the hit then. No, but I think we should acknowledge that the Greek government had borrowed too much. I think most people agree about that. But the problem with then the IMF, ECB, and European Commission approach was, and this is the approach that the IMF had for the longest time, is okay, you have to do austerity. But what they didn't say, or what they often don't say, is, okay, what type of austerity do you have to do? And this is something that actually, in their credit, the IMF is pushing now, the research department is pushing now. And this is also a distinction I want to make, which is something that comes obviously to me as a researcher. The research department of the IMF, if we're going to do like a little bit of a scale of, ethical supremacy, the research, being good here, research department is here these days. They are really pushing sort of very new ideas, but sort of the debt enforcement department is just very conservative still of the IMF, because I looked into some of the recent cases and they just do the same stuff all over again, which they did in Greece, which is, cut government spending. But okay, what government spending should you cut? Because this is also something you read in Varoufakis' book. There were problems with massive tax evasion from very wealthy people in Greece. That was common knowledge. And the IMF talked about that. But then they ended up cutting pensions for the elderly, in general. They ended up cutting a lot of the sort of state salaries. And that is something where I think, they make the classic mistake of treating the government like a household, because, if you're in trouble, Econoboy, sure, you have to cut spending, but your income remains the same. But if a government cuts spending, or at least if it cuts spending to people who actually spend that money back into the economy, then the economy just crashes. And at the same time as sort of tuning down that government spending, you're losing the tax base, if that makes sense, because the economy is a circular system, right?
No, for sure. I mean, that's just the classic explanation of why austerity is bad, right? That in time of fiscal difficulty for the people of a nation, that's probably not the time to cut the support that you're giving those people, because you can compound the problems that you're currently having.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something I think the economics profession as a whole is moving more towards, and also the research department of the IMF. So I hope that they will change their ways. But I think this is like anybody can look at a chart of the Greek economy and compare it to countries where the IMF didn't swoop in with its great common sense advice. And you can see that the path is just so much lower, and that economy has just, it's a real tragedy, to be honest. And also, as a European myself, you can just see it, because there are so many Greek people now everywhere, but in Greece, just hypothetically speaking, of course. But I've really seen it. Like, so many smart Greek people are all over Germany, the Netherlands, UK, because they just can't find work in Greece anymore. So it's very likely that economy has really been destroyed for a bit by the IMF. And I think that is really something that, we are talking a bit clinically right now, right? Yeah, the two of us economists, as we often do. But that's definitely a real tragedy. And I think that a lot of people in many countries where the IMF did the same thing will feel much more passionate about this issue. And I think we should recognize that. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. Obviously. No, I mean, of course. I mean, I say as much in my video about the IMF, which is that it's obviously understandable, especially from the perspective of the countries affected by the IMF, that you would have a more sort of vitriolic view of the dynamics of the IMF, right? That's totally understandable, because whilst the framing of the IMF is just a lending institution, they're just a bank, they're just trying to sustainably finance countries, is quite technocratic, right? That doesn't make the people in those countries who had their pensions cut, their food stamps cut, their social assistance cut, feel any better about it, right? And I say as much in my video on the IMF. And again, that's why, certainly even when viewing the IMF as, just a bank trying to get the money back on its loans and sustainably finance these countries, that doesn't make it right? It just perhaps makes it easier in terms of how you could go about solving those problems in the first place.
Yeah, but also it's very stupid as a bank. Like, if you would even just view it as a bank, they also had to do 3 bailouts, right? Because it just didn't get any better. So even if you look at it as only a bank, it just it's a very stupid idea.
Oh yeah, like at the same time, you're right. That doesn't exactly mean that the IMF is a good bank, right? I guess I should have made that clear in my video. It's not as if countries have only ever had, it's not as if all the countries who have had a run-in with the IMF have only had one run-in, right? That it certainly is you could say quite short-term minded, which might inform some of these policies as well. So yeah, you're totally right as well, that there's perhaps a caveat to that framing, in that perhaps they might just be a lending institution or a bank, but that certainly doesn't mean that they're good at doing the thing that a bank would do, which is get the money back on their loans and hopefully avoid any sort of emergency credit agreements in the future.
Yeah, because money lending to a government is just different than money lending to an individual, right? But I think we're very cordial, Econoboy. I mean, you have been discussing a lot these last few days. Am I being too friendly to you?
Are you being too friendly to me? Interestingly, I was criticized. So the two big pieces of criticism for me in the debate, it seemed like most. It's just the feedback I received from Vosh's channel and from mine seemed to be mostly positive. But the two big criticisms I have received is, one, when we spoke about the IMF, totally got lost in the weeds and probably spoke past each other. And if I had a weak part in the debate, it was when speaking about the IMF. And the second part was that I was too nice, that I should have been more harsh with Vosh and a bit more forceful.
Right.
I guess that's ultimately that. It's not that that's not my style. We've all had passionate debates, but I find it difficult when talking about such a technical subject in economics to be incredibly passionate and sort of in your face about it. We're talking about the IMF, for God's sakes. Now, if we're talking about maybe a $15 minimum wage or DACA recipients, or how the West treats Muslim immigrants or something, I could certainly get more passionate. But on such a dry topic, it can be it can be difficult to get too passionate, I suppose. But I think maybe your audience will say the same thing. You've been too nice to me.
I'm getting a recommendation from Antoine right now to call you a fascist.
Yes. Well, I debated a fascist once, actually. So maybe perhaps that was just a long play to pretend and hide my power level in the fascist world.
So talking about fascism, shall we just round up our discussion about the IMF by quickly mentioning how they did during the pandemic response? Because I think that they have actually lent out rather forcefully, which is a very big break from before, right? And I think it's also something that you see in general during the pandemic, that even in Europe, which is known for its sort of fiscal conservatism, that a lot of there has been massive government spending. It is absolutely insane what has happened in the United States, but also in Europe. And then people were very much afraid, to a certain degree, rightly so, that this was much less in developing countries. This was true, I think. I've noticed this already in South Africa when I still lived there, when the pandemic was in full force, that sort of the measures for companies in South Africa were much, much less generous than they were in the Netherlands. But here, the IMF really did step in, doing what they were supposed to do, namely being a lender of last resort in a situation that is just totally not the fault of these countries. So what they did is they just did a lot of loans to many countries, among which South Africa. I think without a lot of the conditions that they usually do. So feel free to correct me in the chat if I'm wrong about that. But that's what I took away from it. And the second thing they did is that they created a lot of extra, getting back to that, SDRs. So they created a lot of extra money that's not on their balance sheet, but is money nonetheless. And what they did is they allocated all of this to the member countries in proportion to their share of the economy, which benefits deficit countries a lot more than surplus countries, because they sort of increased the pool of liquidity and gave everybody a little bit extra, meaning that countries that were importing more than they were exporting could continue that and wouldn't face this massive run on their currency that typically happens in a crisis, or is much more likely to happen in a crisis. And there, I'm actually quite surprised, and I think this might even show that the orthodoxy is also on the way out in the IMF.
Yeah, honestly, this it would have been probably good for me to look. I honestly didn't expect to speak about the IMF with Bosch as much as we did. So it would have been good for me to do a lot more research. To be clear to the people in the chat, like I said, this debate was really about unequal exchange. The IMF just kind of got brought up, and we spoke about it for, like I said, probably about a third of the time in the middle. And it would have probably been good or made some sense to look up the pandemic response of the IMF and how that might sort of signal a change in the mindset or standard of the IMF generally. But that makes sense if what you're saying is right. And it certainly sounds like they perhaps have turned a leaf. This is the whole movie's been about the horrible, evil IMF, and then at the very end, the IMF has a change of heart, and that's how the movie ends. Perhaps that's the stage that we're on right now, but only time will tell, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's actually a great way to sort of round off our discussion. And I'm wondering if if people watch this who watched your earlier passionate discussions will disagree with us, because we are ending up on a sort of positive note. Although I hope and I think we have discussed the evil that has happened. One question that I am getting from the chat, which is interesting and which you might actually know more about than me, Econ Boy, because you are much more into energy economics than I am, I think, is that people are saying, especially Rick Hunter, I think, are sort of proposing the idea that the IMF would not only increase its finance, but do it for a specific purpose, and that is to counter climate change. And I know this is also a very big discussion point in the central banking community, where they're saying we shouldn't only do QE, we should specifically target that at climate change. And I'm personally I don't know enough of climate change. It's a bit of a blind spot for me. But also, I do actually see the argument of the opponents of that, saying, let the central bank do the central banking stuff and let the government invest or sort of in climate change. But I'm wondering what your view is on that.
It's a good question. Honestly, it's interesting because I do know a lot about energy economics and sort of the sustainability and stuff like that in the world, and it has been interesting as of late, especially with the potential renomination of the U.S.'s central banker named Jerome Powell, who runs the Central Bank of the United States, Federal Reserve. Well, he's been a good Fed chair, no doubt about it, but has he done enough to help the fight against climate change, which is an interesting thing for a central banker to be tasked with? Like, how could they even do anything to help? And sort of the idea would be that, I guess, if you did quantitative easing, you would have sort of a bias towards, if you bought corporate bonds, you might have a bias towards green energy companies, or you might not buy the bonds of included in your bond mix. You might not include fossil fuel companies or things like that, even if they're majors. And so it's an interesting proposal. Now, the question is, should central banks be involved in that kind of thing? Honestly, I don't really think it would make that big of a difference either way, because central banks don't really buy a lot of corporate bonds anyway. That's kind of a new thing. And so I'm not sure if we assume QE is going to maintain the scales it is in terms of how much corporate bonds they buy, it probably wouldn't make that big of a difference anyway. But organizations like the World Bank or the IMF could do probably a lot more than they're doing now in terms of development finance and maybe financing sustainable projects around the world. They could probably do a bit more of that. The World Bank I'm less familiar with. And I know they do more development aid than the IMF does.
Yeah, that's their main purpose.
I'm not sure the types. Yeah, but I'm not sure if I assume that like the World Bank probably engages in like a lot of electrification and sort of maybe water infrastructure, stuff like that, maybe roads. But I mean, for the World Bank and IMF, I mean, it probably would make some sense for them to either not do a lot of fossil fuel development or have at least initially an interest in deploying green assets to fight climate change in general.
Yeah, it's interesting. One criticism that I have read about this recently, but I haven't completed the paper yet. It's called, I think it was called the Wall Street Consensus, sort of a play on the Washington Consensus. I think you can find it on Google. It's actually open and free for everybody, but it's very technical. But I think that the point that they were trying to make, though, is that the problem today with sort of the central bankers' approach is more and more that they're playing into finance already a lot. Like they're going to say, we're going to do QE tied to green bonds or something. But if you do that, you play into the hand of the financial sector in a way, because you are sort of enriching them or sort of choosing them as a channel through which you want to tackle climate change, which is something, with a very bloated financial sector that we have already, that might sort of play into the hands of the evil bankers unwittingly. But I haven't fully yet dove into that argument.
Yeah. I mean, my thoughts on that would just be that climate change, no matter how it's tackled, if we're going to solve the issue, has to be tackled holistically, right? We can't leave anyone off the table when it comes to tackling climate change. And so encouraging bankers and investors to make sustainable investment decisions, potentially by the central bank buying those corporate bonds and lifting their values and getting more investment capital towards those sorts of initiatives is not a bad thing, right? ESG investing, which I've tried to speak to Vash a little bit about it, was that's a good thing. It's a good thing when financial investors see green energy and sustainable development as profitable and as things that they can transition their money into and make a good return in a risk-adjusted sense. And so, I think that ultimately, if the view is anytime we do anything to help investors is bad because those darn investors have been advantaged for so long, to a certain extent, maybe that's true. I think broadly that's kind of an absolutist mindset that probably doesn't lead to the best policy making.
No, I think it's more that let's pick another channel. Let's not do it by enriching investors even further, but just do it ourselves, basically, right? Let's invest directly into this stuff. I think that's
fair, and that's sort of the point, and that's my point is that you can do both at the same time. When it comes to climate change, which is such an existential threat to the world, like there's no greater threat to humanity than climate change, in my opinion. It doesn't make sense to leave anyone outside the room when it comes to that solvency. And so encouraging investors by way of perhaps central bank policy to be fair, again, very marginal extent, not a great impact, but to some marginal extent, investing in those sorts of companies, I think would be part of the mix. Although, to be fair to those people, we would probably agree that the fiscal side is certainly more impactful and needs to have a much bigger bite to this sort of an issue than any central banker is going to have, certainly.
All right, but I think that was a very interesting sort of leeway into a future conversation that we might have once I have dove into this subject a bit further. But with that being said, I think we have fleshed out, hopefully, your discussion your arc of visiting different YouTube channels on development finance and the IMF, and we have, of course, covered the IMF a bit more here. And let's see if we have been very insensitive and we'll get a lot of criticism for this, or have perhaps we've been too academic. But let's hope not. And otherwise we'll just take them on head on. Of course, Econoboy.
There we go. Well, the IMF is the IMF evil. It seems the final result is 40% yes, 60% no. So we appear to have had almost no aggregate impact.
That's true.
That's true. People's opinions,
and I think it also reflects our own feelings a little bit, right? Like, yeah, it has done very evil things, it has done very stupid things, but the purpose of the IMF is still very valuable. It was made with good intentions, and I think you also have to wonder what the alternative is, right? Because if you don't have an international organization doing it, one that's admittedly being influenced by business interests and biases, what's the alternative? Do you think a strong government that would be that the US, for example, is lending to countries directly? Do you think they would not come up with these sorts of conditions, or the EU or China?
Exactly. Yeah. To a certain extent, that's right. I mean, we even mentioned it that the Chinese lending is getting very similar criticisms to the IMF lending, which is interesting. But to round it out, thanks for organizing this discussion. It was really fun. And like I said to your audience, if you're interested in economic analyses similar to what Joeri does, although I do admit quite a bit less editing skill on my videos than Joeri's. And if you're interested in discussions like these, I do a lot of those on the Econoboy YouTube channel. So come by if you want.
Yeah,
but
go check it out.
Anything else, Joeri?
No, that's it. I'm going to kick you out, Econoboy, and then I'm going to talk to the chat a little bit, because I think they asked a lot of questions that I haven't been able to answer yet. And we'll dive into it a little bit together, and then I will quit the stream. And because I have to get back to producing these highly edited videos, which are way too slow at the moment.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on. It's been really fun.
Yes. Thanks for joining, Econoboy. I'm really looking forward to see if you will continue a discussion elsewhere, and I will follow it on your channel.
Sweet. All right. I'll talk to you later, bud.
Take care. Bye. Cheers. All right, chat. What have I missed? Have I read the book Chang's Bad Samaritans? No, I haven't. What's sort of the punch, Noah? Isn't it in the nature of governments and similar bodies of authorities to overreach and cause harm? Yeah, I think so. This is an ethical discussion in major economics. Yeah, but not too much. It does tie into this book that I talked about on the Q&A stream, which is called The Narrow Corridor, which posits an idea that, yes, the government is prone to this, but sort of if civil society can keep pace, then it might actually be able to rein in the government, or how they call it, shackle the Leviathan. So, be the government being this monster, but being shackled by civic society through forms very much to, equal to what we're doing here, right? Like we are having a discussion about all of this as good civilians. Yeah. King Spawn, it's all a conspiracy. Yeah. Oh, Ines' question. Yes, thanks, Kivende. Let me just scroll back up. And with the question of me dabbing on Economics Explained again, I might in the future, although I'm working on a Wendover response video at the moment, which is about development economics. And so we might actually touch upon some of the subjects we've discussed here about sort of is the global South has been abused a bit by the global North, and we might talk about that there. It's a very this is a very touchy subject, so I really want to do my research when talking about it. Thoughts on the IMF role in financial crisis, past, future, and future ones? Yeah, it has sort of really got into this role of being a sort of the global central bank and bailing out countries. But I think it's been a terrible one in many, like, for example, the Asian financial crisis, but there's also the Mexico crisis of 1994, and at the same time there was Russia and Brazil. Greece we've talked about a lot. The Arab Spring is, I think, more contentious. Argentina, also very contentious, and I think that the macro cat is finally coming to say hello. Hey, buddy. Do you hate the IMF as well? But perhaps it has been redeemed a little bit with the. Oh, damn it, Henry. He just walked over my with the wires here. Perhaps it has been redeemed a little bit with this pandemic lending, but let's see. Let's see if that is true. Carlo, is another crash imminent due to debt loads? Well, I am worried about the level of debt, and it has increased a lot as well. I'm actually teaching a course now on international banking and finance, and something we haven't discussed on the channel yet is something called shadow banking, which sounds very, very nefarious, and it is, because it's quite fragile, and the role of the repo markets in all of this. So that will definitely be something that I think we need to discuss, and also just the resurgence of financial markets in general and the resurgence of asset prices is something I am very worried about. But it's just extremely difficult to predict. How long can it go on? How far can it go? I have to do a bit more research into that. Can we expect IMF lending policies to change as an alternative financial institution rises in East Asia? Yeah, like the East Asian Development Infrastructure Investment Bank. So the impression I got from that is especially that the World Bank was very worried about all of this, because these are more sort of World Bank-like institutions, not necessarily saving countries that have what they call balance of payments issues, so a run on their currency, but more investing into countries, infrastructure projects and all of that. And I think that's, for the World Bank, it seems to be very good, because the World Bank also had these issues of the Washington Consensus and just going overboard on too simplistic economics. And for that, competition is good for these types of institutions a little bit, I guess, although, maybe it might have drawbacks that I haven't seen yet, like sort of two spheres of influence again emerging, and sort of some countries being stuck in the middle of those. That could of course be a drawback, but let's see how that goes. Rick, green repo market. Yeah, I don't know about the green repo market, but this is, again, you've talked a lot about this green finance and all of that. I just have to do the research on that one. I don't know too much about it. I'm a bit skeptical for the reasons mentioned, but maybe I'm wrong. The Cuckoo says, can you discuss the ever-increasing US debt ceiling, and what about guarantee US has in case of natural disasters? What do you mean with a guarantee in case of natural disasters? The debt ceiling, I'm a bit conflicted about it, in the sense that, I think it's extremely stupid to have a debt ceiling. because, a government, again, is not a household. Sorry, that's not how it works. But then again, insanely increasing government debt might have a reckoning at some point in the form of inflation. And we don't know how fast that will come. Will that be something that just comes gradually so the government can step on the brake? Or is it something that's very non-linear? I'm not sure, because I don't think we've ever been in this situation for a reserve currency country, right? So that debt ceiling seems very stupid, but I do understand why people might be worried about government debt, even though I'm much more worried about private debt. You're talking about Yellowstone. Yeah, so that's a national park, but I'm not sure how that's a guarantee. I don't know too much about this. Let me see if there are some other questions. Do countries that export a lot cause economic instability because it has to be balanced out by countries that import? Yeah, that's a very well-known theory. I think there's truth to it. This is also something that Keynes, for example, was very worried about, and something that he emphasized when creating the IMF, because in his proposal, the ICU, International Currency Union, not only did debtor countries, so countries that import more and so they have to borrow to finance that, pay an interest rate to the ICU, so the alternative for the IMF, so did creditor countries. And that was ironically blocked by the United States, which is nowadays a massive debtor country. But at the time, it was the biggest creditor country, so it blocked that, That's something Germany would do now, or Netherlands. Yeah, what would be the mechanism that leads to inflation if public debt is too high? That's a great question. That is just something that's something I've been thinking about as well, because that is something I think if you want to make the case that public debt is too high, then you should be able to formulate how that will lead to massive inflation. And I think you should be specific on exactly sort of the steps that this will follow, right? Like the one I mentioned in my response video to Economics Explained on hyperinflation was that there was a loss of faith in the reserve currency aspect of the United States. And that is something that if that happens, although I don't think it's ever happened before, not to my knowledge, the pound sterling lost its reserve currency status very gracefully, I think. But that is something... That's the channel. That was the channel I thought was most, realistic, or seemed to be the most plausible to me. So that could happen at some point. But the thing is that people then bring against that is, what's the alternative? What's the alternative world currency? I don't know at the moment. I mean, yeah, China's economy is massive, but it has a lot of capital controls, meaning that money doesn't flow to other countries easily. So it's very difficult to use their currency. And the euro area is very fragile, in the sense that we have a central bank, but not a government. And so it's still not sure if, at some point it might break up. So that's not very handy if you want to be a reserve currency. So I don't know. Rick, confidence in consumers and increasing velocity of money. Yeah. So that's the other channel, right? Like the velocity of money might increase. And that is something that means that sort of money will move from financial markets, because, if it's invested in financial markets, velocity drops to sort of real markets or real products. But again, how would that happen very quickly? Would you sort of, I can see that you have no longer trust in US stock markets, for example, but, will you then run to the supermarket to spend all of that stuff on goods? And also, if you look at production capacity at the moment, or capacity utilization in, for example, the United States, it's still pretty low. I think you can look this up on a website called Fred. I'll just type it in the chat, Fred. It's apparently around 70 or 80% or something. And yes, at the moment we see a lot of difficulty in sort of goods coming to us, but it seems that a major chunk of that comes from supply chain disruptions rather than not being able to produce enough stuff. But anyway, I'm making a video right now on the great inflation debate. And so what I'm trying to do with this other channel, Unlearning Economics, is sort of review all the arguments. So you have a lot of people saying, oh, we're going to have massive inflation and it's going to remain. And then we have a lot of people saying, yeah, we have inflation. Like everybody agrees we have inflation. But it's transitory, right? It's temporary. So what I'm going to try to do is summarize those debates and then judge them with Learning Economics. So that's going to be not my next video, but the video after. But my next one is still going to be the central banking history one. Which has been delayed a little bit because I have someone helping me out with editing. And that is something we still have to figure out how to work with each other and get used to, or sort of making this process more reliable. But that video is coming. It's almost ready. I've already finished recording it. Yeah. And with that being said, thank you all so much for joining. I think I went through quite a few questions still. I hope you found this discussion interesting. I will try to make this a common thing. These live streams and discussions. I also want to interview a couple of people. I have an interview scheduled with someone from the Reserve Project, which is a cryptocurrency project that wants to make a cryptocurrency the next SDR, the next global reserve currency. And they think this is especially interesting for emerging economies that have had to deal with hyperinflation. I might be a bit skeptical about hyperinflation in the United States, but it doesn't mean that I don't take this very seriously in other countries. That is something we're going to discuss in this format. So this stream was me also, trying to get my hands dirty a little bit and find out how a stream with a guest works. But I really enjoyed it. So that is going to be recurring, but I will focus again on my proper, nicely produced videos. I'll get back to that. And thank you so much for the discussion. I really had a laugh at some of your jokes. And I'm just going to quit the session by answering Greg Simithian's question. Best way to get a research position? Publish a paper, Greg. Get to work. Publish a paper. That's really the best way. If you can make it work to get a publication for a paper, or even a working paper, then that's better than any resume. So try to make that happen. It's not as easy as it sounds. Yeah, Kingspawn, emerging markets running on a cryptocurrency sounds sketchy as. I see where you're coming from, and I will be critical at this issue. But it's a stable coin, so that is something a bit different than like Bitcoin or something. So it's tied to the US dollar. So let's see, there are many interesting projects there. Let's see if they thought it all through. All right. What's a countdown? Can you do that in the stream or something? I don't know. Anyway, it was a joy. I will see you all around. Thank you all for watching, and look out for my next video. It is coming. All right. Cheers.